Hello, my name is Alex Isles. In today's episode, we're going to be answering the question, is at the start of the Anglo-Saxon period, where did the Romans go? Thank you for joining me again. So, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing what happened at the end of Roman Britain. So in the previous episode, we discussed the semi-mythological Hengist and Horsa and whether or not they were actually real people or if they were made up to give legitimacy to the early Anglo-Saxon kings of Kent, and then also how that connected in with the other kings of the British Isles, with the Anglo-Saxon kings then wanting to draw legitimacy from that. But in today's episode, we're going to be looking a lot more at the archaeology. And with this archaeology, I'm going to be starting to talk about late Roman Britain and some of the other influences as well. So to start off with, I'm going to be talking about how in the late Roman period in Leicester, and alongside that as well in Rochester and in Silchester, all around in the post-Roman occupation, we still continue to see people living in these towns. Now, for a long time, archaeology wasn't able to actually pick out the development of post-Roman Britain. And the reason why they couldn't pick out post-Roman Britain was because of the fact it just looked like a brown layer in the archaeological deposit. So often archaeologists would just dig straight through to get to the nice Roman stones, the inscriptions, all of that sort of stuff. And they were just like, oh well, all of this brown layer here, it's just soil and rubbish that's built up after the Roman occupation, and it basically just shows that these towns were not occupied, that they were abandoned. The actual reality is that they're wooden buildings. And this is something that's really quite amazing in the late Roman period, is that actually, as the economy changed in the Roman period, because so often people say an economic collapse, the economy did change. This large centralized empire that is centralized around the power of the emperor. It requires taxation, it's generating a lot of wealth, and then it's investing that back into the provinces through the Roman army, through trade, through factories, all of that sort of stuff there. Now in the late Roman period, taxation starts to break down, and there's a possibility around 410 AD, we have this letter that says Britain looks your own defences, and so when we have that, the suggestion is that the government broke down and we start seeing an end of the Roman system. But the interesting thing is the archaeology doesn't necessarily show this, because in the 4th century in Leicester, when you'd think that possibly the whole economic system is falling apart, you start seeing halls being built in Leicester in the northeast corner of the town. Now, when they're starting to build these halls, they're very much what we would call Anglo-Saxon style halls. But what's really confusing is that a large Roman style townhouse is also being built at the same time. So there's two different styles of construction here. A Roman townhouse is being built side by side by Anglo-Saxon halls. What's going on, you know? Is it just the fact that there's two groups of people living here? Is there someone who's still holding on to the old Roman style of living? Have they still got the economic power to build in stone during this period? There's something really interesting going on. On top of this as well, we also see that in Leicester, in the Forum, which was where most of the business was conducted in a Roman settlement, that they actually start having metalworking, glass production in the beginning of the 4th century that then continues through into the 6th century. So we've got something going on here where a building has now changed its purpose. It's now a location where stuff is being produced in that area. And it's not necessarily about the trade that you would see in the Roman period. It's now a location where stuff is being produced and possibly sold on site or being shipped to other locations, which I find really, really interesting, because if you connect it back up here to the north of England on Hadrian's Wall, we see something similar at Burdoswald in Cumbria, which in Roman times was referred to as Banna. What happens is that one of the granaries at Banna collapses, and when it collapses, it's then used as a quarry and it's taken apart, and then the next door granary is no longer used as a grain store, probably because of the fact that there isn't a centralized supply system for the British Isles anymore. The commander is probably having to look at a lot more regional based supplies, so they're relying on local farmers and local producers to supply the fort. And so they transform the other granary, this huge granary building, into a hall. And when it's transformed into a hall, we know that when they were laying a new floor, a coin of Theodosius I, who was around about 395 AD, or at least that's when the coin was probably dropped, and a black glass ring are then covered by new material. So we know just at the end of the 4th century, there is evidence for something going on where banner is being changed in use. Similarly, at Vindolanda, the famous Roman fort just behind Hadrian's Wall, and at Housted's Roman fort, there is something similar going on where the commanding officers' houses are often taken apart, and alongside this as well, the headquarters building then becomes the new commanding officer's house, and we see weapon stores being moved inside of these buildings, and alongside this as well, one of the rooms is generally always turned into a butcher's. Now, when you don't have a centralized economy, how do you keep your men under control? You've got to think about this in a very different style, because these men no longer are relying on a constant supply of silver coins or gold coins. They can't rely on that anymore because it's not coming from centralized mints. So instead, the probability is the commanders are now controlling the weapons and using those as gifts, and are controlling food. And so as long as you keep your men fed, as long as you keep them honored with weapons and stuff like that, you continue to keep power. And what we also see is the effect of Christianity, because while the Roman government collapses, the power of Rome is still there through the Pope. Because what we see is that there is a heresy led by a man called Pelagius, who it may even have been Irish according to some sources, because his name literally means in Greek "of the sea." So there's a chance that he is Irish, and he then comes out with a heresy that says that you don't need Jesus to actually get salvation. Instead, by doing good deeds and things like that, you can actually be saved, which goes against the divinity of Christ set by the church, or the understanding of the church. So because of that, Pelagius is then condemned, and when he's condemned, what happens is that in 425, 426, a missionary called Germanicus goes across to Britain, and there's enough Romano-British leaders for him to meet and for him to go out and to conduct miracles and to actually check on the health of the British church. And then he visits in the 430s again, and he leads the British in an attack or a battle against Pictish and Saxons. And very interestingly, it doesn't seem to be in the south. He describes, large valleys. So again, it could be up in the north of Britain where he's leading these British troops against Pictish and Saxon forces as well, which again, seeing as the fact that Picts are mentioned, probably would incline me towards a northern British battle site for Germanicus and his miracle. So there may be an end of Roman authority from centralized authority from Rome, but there may also be a continuation of the actual authority of Rome through the Pope and through the church at that time. Now, again, there is another very interesting academic. An academic I've come across is Peter Streever, and he writes a book called Language, Contact and the Origins of the Germanic People. Now, very interestingly, he actually suggests that because of the number of German troops that have migrated into the British Isles, that then actually had an effect where the Germanic troops who had been coming into the British Isles probably mixed with the native Britons, and on the east coast of Britain there was a probability that they were actually speaking a German dialect even in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And when they were speaking this German dialect, the really interesting thing about it is it's actually got a British accent. So the native Britons, who many people refer to as the Celts, they would have given their accent to this dialect of German. And there is a good evidence to suggest this, and it's quite an interesting one as well, to actually suggest that the Anglo-Saxons had been living in here for quite a while. Alongside this as well, there is also a fantastic PhD I've come across, which is called Germanic Migrants in Roman Britain by Cheryl Louise Clay, published in 2009. Clay puts forward a really interesting argument and a fantastic piece of work, and this is for her PhD. And when she puts this forward, she points out the Roman troops in the British Isles were disproportionately German, with 28 cohorts of troops actually being of Germanic descent or Germanic culture. Now, when she puts that forward, to put that in context, the next largest ethnic group were Gaulish troops, and they only make up 10 cohorts. So 18 more cohorts of Germans exist than the Gaulish cohorts, and then the rest of the cohorts make up much less numbers, with, for instance, 8 cohorts of Spaniards, 4 cohorts of Romanians or Dacians, and so you can see there how it goes less, and then it's 1s and 2s of other cultures. So disproportionately, it is Germanic, then Gaulish, who are having an influence on the British Isles, or the area that would eventually become England. So these people are coming in, they are possibly marrying with the local British culture. Then when they're marrying with the local British culture, they're probably passing on their language or mixing their language with the pre-existing Brythonic or Celtic languages that would have existed in the British Isles. And then this is also combined with additional research done by Y.N.L. Myers. And he suggests that the Germanic Foederati would have made a huge amount of influence on the British Isles as well. So how much of the British troops were actually German, and how actually maybe this would have set a really strong foundation for what would eventually become the Anglo-Saxon culture, even as early as the 3rd century. Because in the 3rd century, what we see is that there are already probably quite a few Germanic troops here. Vandals and Burgundians were brought into Britain by Probus in 276 to 282 AD, so 3rd century. And then alongside this as well, during the Gallic Empire, where basically Britain broke away from the Roman Empire for a while and was an independent nation, the leader of that was a guy called Caracus. And Caracus, he's very interesting because his name is Germanic and actually means nice ears, which was actually quite a complimentary and nice name within the Germanic peoples. And he was the military commander of the Roman Empire in Britain, the splinter empire, and he ruled from 286 to 293 when he was assassinated by his treasurer, Alcetus, who then ruled for a further 3 years from 293 to 296. So when he's assassinated by Alcetus, Alcetus is then defeated by Constantinius, who invades Britain, and when he defeats Alcetus, Alcetus's forces are heavily Frankish, stationed in London. Now when he defeats him, he then brings in his own troops, and his own troops probably would have been quite German as well, because we know that when Constantine the Great is proclaimed emperor in York, one of the guys who proclaims him emperor is a guy called Crocus, and he's a king of the Alemanni, and Alemanni is a Germanic tribe. So there's a likelihood that he actually could have been a defeated Germanic leader who was then forced into subjugation by Constantinius. And when he was forced into subjugation, there's 2 possibilities of when that could be, because Constantinius fought against the Germans in 287 and 303. And so because of that, there's plenty of opportunity where he could have taken captured or defeated Germans, brought them into Roman service, and then brought them into the British Isles, and then settled them there to basically bulk up the British troops, and alongside this as well, basically remove them from their previous power bases and make them allied to Roman power. So again, it's another interesting one where Britain is seen as a location where you can carefully bring in Germans, and if previously both of the usurpers had actually been of Germanic descent, it then adds again to this thing where Britain is a place where there are already quite a few Germans in the British Isles. So moving on to the Great Barbarian Conspiracy, which occurred in 367, so in the later part of the 4th century. And what happens here is groups of Saxons, groups of Scotii, which is Irish pirates, and Picts all assault Britain from every direction, and Britain is plunged into chaos. When it's plunged into chaos, the Dux Britannicum, who is the commander stationed in York, who commanded all British forces in the north of the province, is killed. And when he's killed, his name, Dux Britannicum Folofedius, his name is actually of Germanic descent again. So we see that there is influence here where we have a Roman, very important, influential leader with a Germanically inspired name. So when we're looking at where did the Romans go, there's a very interesting question here, because it actually shows in late Roman Britain from the 3rd century onwards into the 5th century, they are settling Germanic troops in the British Isles from actually the 2nd century AD, with much of the forces on Hadrian's Wall and in the British Isles being Germanic. Then following on from that, defeated Germanic troops are then brought into the British Isles again to be settled here from the 3rd century. And then alongside that as well, usurpers in the British Isles are of Frankish and Germanic descent as well. And when they're brought in, they are then settled here. And then Roman military officials in the Dux Britannicum is also of Germanic possible descent because he carries a Germanic name. So we're seeing that there is a strong Germanic presence in Roman Britain, which then lays a foundation for when Roman governments falls apart, that possibly these people just go, well, we're going to do things the way we did things back home. We no longer have an incentive to become Roman because there's no Roman taxation system, there's no Roman, military system that we can then get promotion and rewards from, and therefore we are not going to move into a nice Roman villa. Let's just build things like we did back home in Germany and in Denmark and places like that, and let's settle here and live our lives as we would back home. And then so the regional commanders, who are probably already quite Germanic, start just living as tribal kings, and those tribal kings would eventually evolve into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as we see them today. So it's a really interesting one when we see the beginnings of what we'd understand as Anglo-Saxon England, and these Roman allies who were brought into the British Isles, settled here and fought for the Roman Empire. So in conclusion, there's a likelihood that there were many Germanic troops in Britain from as early as the 2nd century AD, but with the majority of them coming from the 3rd century onwards. And when you have these Germanic troops in the British Isles, that then laid the foundations for what we would understand today as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you'd like to support me further, I do also have a Patreon, and you can find that in the description below. But until next time, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching.